It's nice to be back in the UAE, where I used to live. And my next meeting's in Barcelona, which looks a little bit difficult to get to, so I think I'm going to be stuck here for a couple of days, which is just fabulous news. So I found an advertisement for travel recently, and it said, like a story from classic mythology around the globe in quest of wonders and mysteries. And I thought that was quite nice. And of course, it was from 100 years ago, and it's Thomas Cook celebrating its 50th anniversary with cruises. And it sort of struck me that actually there's a lot of our business that has not really changed that much. You're still sold a package to get on an airplane and then to get on a cruise ship. People don't take the railway quite as much as they used to very long distance. But it feels that travel actually is the experience economy. So for us, it's a little bit different, because what technology has done is it's just made the experience economy much easier and much more accessible. It's also brought down the cost enormously. And of course, we owe all of that to Thomas Cook, who invented the modern concept of travel about 150 years ago. And this was a package, and he could sell you a railway ticket, and he could sell you an around-the-world ticket. And this had never been done before. And the experience economy does look really different for us in travel. This is what it usually looks like. This is the theory behind it, right? You start with your commodities, you take stuff out of the earth, you make some goods, you then deliver services, and you can then stage experiences. And each time what's meant to happen, the theory is that the pricing becomes more premium and you're able to differentiate yourself much more. So that's the theory. I just think it's wrong. I don't think it applies to us at all. And I know this because my 15-year-old daughter is totally able to package up her own experience in Europe by herself. I don't think it's very differentiated, or at least there's literally nothing that she ever asks me. She doesn't care about the fact that I work in travel. She never comes to me for advice. She thinks she can do it by herself. And the other thing that strikes me is you can package stuff up really, really cheaply. And this goes back to something that Nick said about the importance of taking cost out, because the goods, everything that we have and wear, are much cheaper. The services are now cheaper, and you can access information about them more transparently. And the services are easier to do by yourself. And so what this means is it's becoming commoditized and it's becoming facilitated. And to me, travel is now more like buying a pair of headphones, because you can buy a flight for $10, you can buy earphones for $10, you can also buy a flight for $500, and you can buy a pair of earphones for $500 as well. Travel has become much more of a consumer good. So the challenge is, how can you actually participate in a way that makes sense? So I don't have too many consultant slides. I think I've got about 6 in all, but I will throw some numbers at you. We ran some numbers. We looked at about 1 billion airline fares. We looked at about 1.5 billion hotel fares. And then we cross-checked this. And what we got to, for most of Northern Europe, is this is how the channels split at the moment. So hotels to this side, and airlines to that side. And what you see is that the legacy carriers have about half of their distribution is online direct. The online travel agencies, the more traditional indirect, the offline direct, which is interesting, and then the TMCs. And you can see that for hotels, it's really, really different. And the striking thing for hotels, of course, is the difference here between independents and chains. So for hotels, online travel agents are frankly more important. Yeah. For the airlines, this is the problem they're facing, and this has totally changed. And this is why your relationships with airlines are becoming more complex, let's say. This just shows, depending on whether you're premium or non-premium as a large European airline, and depending on which channel you're selling through, whether the ticket you're selling makes money, is neutral, or loses money. So for airlines, it's becoming increasingly important how they're selling, who they're selling to, who they're partnering with. This is very different from 15 years ago. This simply is brand new. And it's not surprising that these two impacts are happening, because airlines are very consolidated, hotels are very fragmented, and what that means is the airlines, in theory, have more influence, but they're being cut by one phenomenon. And I want to talk about this because I think it impacts everything that we do. And it's not a new phenomenon, but I don't think the scale is fully understood. So short-haul, low-cost carrier is the story. And I just want to show you two graphs, which I hope will bring this to light. This is Europe, Middle East, and Africa. The number of seats, how it's changed over the last 15 years. And what you see is the legacy carriers have grown with market. This is market growth. The LCCs have been growing at 12%, and the tour operators have been growing a little bit more than market until Thomas Cook fell away. What I want to show you is the contrast with long haul. This is how big long haul is. The entire long haul in number of seats is not even half of the increase that we've seen in low-cost carriers in the last 15 years. Long haul, of course, it's good to package up, it's good to sell, it's very interesting business. There's no doubt about it being a big business, but it's not been where the change is. And indeed, there's not really been much change. If you look in the UK, the ratio of package to independent traveling, so packages have fallen from about 60 to 40%. But what's interesting about them is they are sometimes slightly counter-cyclical. What we're seeing in Europe, at least, is that the package tour is becoming the thing that guarantees you a fixed cost. And again, this goes back to Nick's point about having to really consider lower cost, because the customer is increasingly becoming worried about the total cost of the package. And so in the past, you took a package because there was no other way of doing it. Now, one of the reasons you take a package could be to make sure that your cost is limited. At the high end, you'll be taking a package because there are some things that you can't do yourself. And this is a question I'll ask at the end about whether this is becoming a bit like supermarkets, which is supermarkets seem to be doing well in the high end and well in the low end, and everything in the middle seems to be eroding. Only you, the agents, fully understand in each market what the right ratio of package to independent is. And that's not something that can be seen from the outside. Okay, so what's actually changed then? So if experience itself is not new to our industry, what has changed? Well, there's the planning world, and we saw some things from Mark about this. There's the purchase and the decision, the payments and the rewards. We heard about M-Pesa. And there's the travel itself. And again, I would argue that, interestingly for us, the travel component per se is not really changing. What's absolutely transforming is all of this stuff to the left. And there are many industries where it's actually a bit different, where the actual thing itself has changed. So the advertising budgets are very different. If you look at the budgets of advertising, the airlines seem to spend between 1% and 4% of their revenues in advertising. The hotels are spending more, but of course, nothing can compete with the giant OTAs, who are amongst the top 10. Some things, however, don't change. What doesn't change is the travel agents are still very large. What doesn't change is the TMCs are still very significant. What does change is there's some new types of TMC in the market, and then these elements around the right here. It's not clear how this is going to shake out, right? We're not too sure how the airlines and hotels are going to end up with their marketing. I spend my life talking to airline and hotel execs, and they just don't really know. Should they compete with the big OTAs? Should they leverage the OTAs? It's just not known. The impact of NDC is unclear. It seems to be pretty clear 30 or 50 years out, but all short-term forecasts seem to be getting it wrong. It does present an opportunity for airlines to align their costs with the segment value. It creates an opportunity for indirect channels to offer the same granularity of product as on the airline's home website, so that'll be interesting. But also it creates an opportunity for the indirect channels, to be bundling. It's going to make your lives, in theory, easier. Okay? Although it's going to be more, it's not going to be so much about which way the booking comes through. It's going to be about the fact that you can now create things that you couldn't create before. Some things still don't change. This hasn't changed at all. And even though everyone thinks that it did change, in fact, it didn't change because Hayes has bought all the Thomas Cook shops. I've read some really terrible newspaper articles in the last 2 weeks about the fall of Thomas Cook. I've rarely read so much rubbish as I have. The truth is, most physical locations that sell mostly package holidays are going to remain. What I have seen in the airline world, which has been fascinating, is how quickly capacity and how rapidly planning can now absorb and take over. And that wasn't so true before. So it's really interesting seeing how flexible the whole airline space has now become. And the airlines do need to stay very flexible, because if you take a short weekend break, mid-high, let's say about $1,000, this is how the costs are currently breaking down. This is totally different from when I was in my 20s. The flight used to be really expensive. In fact, the flight was where you started. You had to book the flight first. If you didn't have your flight, you wouldn't do anything else. Now it's completely different. My wife doesn't care about the flight. She will go ahead and book something, and then she'll tell me, sort out the flights. And that's quite stressful. You know, there's a hotel I want to go to, there's a particular Airbnb location that I want to go to, fix those airplane things, you know. Then what I sometimes find is I spend just as much money getting to and from the airport than I do on the flight itself. Psychologically, as someone in their 40s, I struggle with that. Maybe younger people find that okay. And then we're spending all kinds of other things, and we're obviously always buying stuff at the airport that I always regret. So this is very different. Okay. So for airlines now, they're very second place. And that's quite interesting for you, for the indirect channels, because your relationships with the hotels become increasingly important, because the hotels are under enormous strain from the online travel agents. And that has literally totally flipped in the last 10 years. Money, well, that's it. That's the circular note, again invented by Thomas Cook. It's quite interesting. I can remember the modern version of this, the traveler's check. I can remember using these in my late teens. I can remember that. My French grandfather was obsessed with traveler's checks. I had to go to Italy. I was going from France to Italy. It was a really, really big deal going from France to Italy back then. And he was so worried I was going to have this stuff stolen from me. Now, of course, it's completely different. And I don't know if any of you use these travel cards. They're extraordinary. You can avoid all the exchange rates. It's very easy. It's just completely different. It's something that travelers used to really worry about. It was something that was a value add. Now it just doesn't really matter at all. Another thing that's super interesting, we think, is that the channels, you, the agencies, are making your own loyalty programs. So those are the very big ones. But if you take a small to medium boutique niche player, like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, they also have a subscription, a loyalty program. This, I think, is very interesting. And I think you should increasingly feel comfortable trying to charge your clients for creating things for them. I think we need to move past the world where you don't think that what you do is valuable. Because if the client doesn't want to do it, or sometimes doesn't have the time, then you should step in, and they're quite comfortable paying. And you know, some things really don't change much. The Orient Express hasn't changed at all, really. It doesn't go down to Baghdad. That train ride is no longer available. But you can get down to Istanbul. The Emirates Lounge, well, I think someone got there before them. It's just that we grow old and we forget what there was before. What is new? Well, from my smartphone, there's a bunch of stuff I couldn't really do before, which I can. Okay. I can pretty much manage everything I need on a trip on my smartphone. I just don't need to worry about anything at all. I mean, just nothing. I can get an app to tell me what packing list I need based on where I'm going. Just sorts me out. That's really easy. Wherever I am, I can find an ATM anywhere in the world. The travel guide can be on my screen. No problem converting currency. I can even go and check my seat map details. No, I can literally choose my seat before I get on the airplane. I can do some deep statistical analysis of flight costs. It's just there, it's online, it's free. I can set an alert on FA Watchdog. I can just put the alert out. You know, I'm going to travel in 3 months, just go do your business, and I'll just wait and see. So this is the bit which is where it's all become a lot easier. Not everyone's very good at doing this, though. I think that's important to keep in mind. These things are available, and they are taking some of the growth in the market. But if you look at their actual penetration, it's very minor. So how would you design a winning customer experience? And this is when I'll just become a management consultant for 3 slides, if you'll bear with me, OK? So now I'm going to go back to some of the things that we were hearing in the earlier speeches. So we are moving from traditional boundaries to an evolving travel landscape. Travel is not so much about discrete moments as about a state of mind. So what am I doing this for? It's not so much about specific needs as it is about exact needs. Okay? It's not these things sort of considered in separation. It's me and all my needs as one. And I think when people talk about, a single bundle for a single person, it sounds pretty crazy, but I've seen some of the technology in action. This stuff is actually happening. I think within 2 years, the major hotels and airlines loyalty programs, and maybe the large OTA loyalty programs, will be doing this very, very convincingly. We're going to go to omni-channel. We heard that earlier from Nick, so that's not particularly new. I think this is quite interesting. I don't know if you saw those interesting articles about people realizing that their phones and their Alexas were listening to them because they were having a conversation about travel, and then their social media feed began to give them what they had been talking about. I think this stuff is already happening. I just don't think we really know about it. And I'm not sure, again, how I feel about that. I don't know how you feel about that. And it's not going to be so much about you all racing for your market share within your industry. It's going to be you trying to get the share of mind. So it's getting inside your customers' heads in total. Not so much about delivering one piece, but delivering everything. And so how's everyone reacting? Well, some are expanding and trying to get into everything. Some are trying to really protect the current position, some adjacencies, and some players are just doubling down and are being very, very focused on what they do. The hierarchy of needs, we're all familiar with that from school. I personally struggle with my red eyes. I don't even seem to get to that. I think it was Robin who made the important point that, of course, this has changed. Whoops. Yeah. And I think we'd all agree with that. But being consultants, we couldn't resist taking it to the next level. So when we work with our major travel clients, what we've done is we've created a different hierarchy of needs. What you have at the bottom level is the functional. So this is just the simple. It's not easy to do, but it's simple to understand. What does it do? Does it reduce my cost? Does it simplify my life? Does it make me money? Does it organize my life? Does it help me connect? Does it keep me informed? Beyond that, it gets more emotional. So how does this feel? Right? Those of you who travel, which is every single one of you, when you go into an airport, frankly, the anxiety of security is the sensation that most of us are feeling. It's actually what we care about. People are willing to pay interesting amounts to reduce security queue anxiety. Above this, we have life-changing elements. This is where the luxury brands kick in. Right? This all starts to get quite different. And it's only a niche set of travel players who will rise up and for whom it will be relevant to be at the top. And then at the very top, we have self-transcendence, and this is quite interesting, given flight shaming. There are some things that are now reversing. So let's just take one example of how we apply this. Well, if you were to look at Expedia, they're quite focused. By the way, this looks very different for all major travel companies. It looks very different for airlines. It looks very different for hotels. And again, between the legacies and the LCCs. And the raw need that they address is bringing the world within reach. And I think this is quite interesting because I'm curious as to whether you're thinking about what the raw need of your customers are. Like the simple thing. If there was just one thing that you were doing for them, what would that be? I'll sum up, and then we might or might not have some questions. So I think there are really two things that all of this is doing. The first one is everything is just lower cost. I mean, some of it's lower cost in nominal terms, right? My flights are cheaper in actual pounds than they were in the late 1980s. Okay, it used to cost me £150 to go to Spain and back. It can cost me £60 to go to Spain and back. And there's been a lot of inflation since then, all right? So it is unbelievably cheaper to fly than it has been for decades. It is quite marked. Okay. There's huge expanded room stock, and actually every major city in the world has gone through its own shock. Right? Every major city has tried to address this in a different way. But it has been a significant shifting of room stock. And what Uber did is it just grew the number of taxis. It's not the only platform, but it did create a step change simply in the number of taxis available. And then there's hyper-transparency and hyper-communication. Everyone knows how much things cost. Okay, your value in the indirect channel is certainly not to tell your customer how much something costs anymore. I mean, no one really needs to walk into your properties to know that. They do it on their smartphone. They do it in about 25 seconds flat, actually. And then if you want to, you can look at the 300 combinations to get you to your destination on that day. Loyalty miles value, well, this used to drive behavior, but increasingly what we're seeing is people value the loyalty programs for the experiences that they help with. I mean, in my line of business, we will have millions of miles, we never use them, we don't know what to do with them. When we want to use them, we're not allowed to use them, and it just becomes very frustrating. But we do it because we can have fast track. We do it because we can board early. You know, we do it because it makes our life at the airport interesting. And that's quite different. Okay. The world of reviews, I've not touched on because I'm a boring consultant, but of course it is interesting that you can read 300 reviews of the hotel that you might be going to, and it's all right there on your phone. And so this is hyper-transparency. So when you recommend something to your customers, okay, their children will probably be online as soon as their parents get home, and they'll be checking whether the reviews match the advice that you're giving or the package that you've put together. And so your role becomes very different, because in the past, you could talk as a trusted advisor about travel needs to people, and they would listen because you are the experts. And now they will listen to what you say, but they're going to run off and they're going to ask someone else. And finally, maps, that people don't get lost anymore. I mean, all hotels used to have maps. I don't know if you remember this. They used to give maps a lot. And the concierge or at reception, you check in, there's, you know, here's a map, and you go, oh, thank God, there's a map. I'm totally lost. And now I don't. I just get my Google Maps up, and I'm like, oh, okay, it's a 10-minute walk. I'll just walk there. It's also been bad for taxis, because taxis used to take people 300 meters because people didn't know it was 300 meters. So that's all finished too. So there are some small little bundles of niche profits which are sort of gradually being ironed out. All right, some final thoughts so I can stay on time. I mentioned this before, but is the market spreading high-low? And I think for the indirect channels, this is a really interesting question. Do you need to divide your business so that you are able to process high volumes of low-value transactions in a low-cost way, but also cater to the higher-end market where there is significant value that you can add and profits to be had? And I'm curious, I'm sure in all your markets this is playing out differently, but in the more mature and richer markets, what we're seeing is this distinct separation between high-low. And the way that people deal with the low is the ancillarized option. Okay? People are not rational when they book. Okay? The reason that airlines behave the way they do is because we are not rational. All right? Which is why the best business is to sell sunglasses at the airport, because someone who spent 3 weeks trying to get $5 off their airplane ticket will walk into that airport and buy a $300 pair of sunglasses they do not need. So I think selling sunglasses at airports is just the best business. Okay. Will airlines and hotels ever be able to match channel marketing spend? And I think the answer is no, probably not. So this is a problem on the airline side, but it's a problem on the indirect channel side. because the indirect channels are not as consolidated as the largest online channels. Corporate behavior in the next recession. Now, this one's a little bit spooky, but I try not to get sad. We're not sure. So in the past, what has happened is the recession comes, every corporation reviews its travel policies, and it's decided everyone will fly economy class. Okay? Then the CEO flies economy class and changes his or her mind, and then there's a slight revision to the travel policy where we start playing with premium economy, and then the 8-hour limit becomes 7, becomes 6, becomes 5.5, becomes 5.25, and everyone tries to get there. But what has never happened before, and I'm curious about, is whether channel limitations will come across. Now, I have to book through my TMC for work. I find that very frustrating because I literally have the option of booking in 23 seconds on my phone and having it booked directly through the airline, and I've got it all here, or my assistant books it through the TMC. Now, I know we get a corporate discount through there, so it's probably better financially for my company that it goes through that way, but it's very agonizing for me because I've got to wait 6 hours to get my flight confirmation. And so as we head towards a European slowdown or recession, I don't know what the polite word in society is these days, I'd suggest that you be very focused on the service to the high end. Because I think it may not just be the class of service that moves this time around. Regulatory change. Now, I mentioned that I might not get to Barcelona. There's all kinds of international protests going on, but also in the UK now they're floating the idea of a tax on air miles. It's quite interesting. So really treating air miles as a benefit in kind, really treating it as an asset or as an income for the customer. The impact will not be very big on the kind of global J-class travel. I'm curious about the short-haul Y-class. I don't think we know yet what happens when an air ticket that was very, very cheap at about $50, $60 return, when that goes to 75. It may have no impact. We're not too sure. But if you look at the explosion of LCCs in the Middle East, right? If you look at Fly Dubai, if you look at Air Arabia, and then if you go over to India and you see Indigo and what's happening there, what you're seeing is the arrival of mass tourism travel short haul coming into this region. It's coming in about 15 to 20 years after Europe, but it's coming in about 3 times faster, which is very, very striking. It's absolutely extraordinary how quickly it's coming. And it's coming in the perfect business model. It's actually coming in the kind of ULCC Ryanair way. And finally, how intentional will travel companies become? And this would just be my final thought to you, which is sometimes it's better to just zero base what you're spending your money on, what markets you're focusing on, which clients you're focusing on. We always budget a few points, but it might be that all these changes that we've heard about from Robin, from Nick, from Mark, and that I've been talking about now, that these are shifting the profit pools and the value quite significantly. And so the way to deal with that would be to let go of certain business segments, certain clients that you have, that you might have had for a long while, but all of a sudden they're just not performing how they used to. And there might be new markets and clients and segments where all the action is happening. And it's how intentional you are. It's how willing you are to stop doing stuff and to start doing new stuff, which will probably define the winners and the losers, because you all know what's going on. I don't think anything I've shown you is new or is a secret. The question is, when you put it all together and you wrap a very, very cold towel around your head, do you actually decide to stop doing certain things? I think that's all for now. Robin, what do I do now, apart from take a photo with you?
People pay me for photographs of me,
yeah,
but it's fine. Thank you very much. And Geoffrey, thank you.
Thank you.